Dave, special thanks to you for joining us again. As Gunther just mentioned, we began our series with you way back when. We've since done something like 85 webinars. Yours was the first. So you got us off to a great start, and we're really very happy to welcome you back, and welcome to everyone else in the UK, in the US, and elsewhere around the world who are tuning in to this very special webinar, Anti-Semitism, specifically in the UK, since the October 7th attack. We're soon coming up on the first anniversary of that awful day. We're still understanding, still to understand some of what happened there, but there's no doubt that it changed history and for the worse. And we're dealing with all the ramifications of that today, tomorrow, and for an ongoing time as well. Dave Rich will help to inform us on developments within his own country. He knows it extremely well. For some 30 years, he's been a key player in Britain's Community Security Trust, an agency that looks after the security and well-being of Jews and others in the UK. He's also a well-regarded published author on aspects of anti-Semitism. His first book was on the left in the Labour Party during the time of Corbyn. More recently, Dave is the author of this book, which I highly recommend. It's called, as you see, Everyday Hate. The subtitle is How Anti-Semitism is Built into Our World and How You Can Change It. Read it and learn lots. I for sure did. It's an ongoing subject. Dave pays ongoing attention to it in his Substack, Everyday Hate. We're putting the link to that in the chat. If you don't yet know it, by all means, look it up. Dave, it's now my pleasure to hand over to you. We look forward to listening to you, learning from you, and discussing some of the most salient issues with you after you conclude.
Thank you, Alvin. Thank you, Gunther. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us at this webinar today, wherever you are. I'm going to be talking, as Alvin and Gunther said, about some aspects of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as we've seen them develop in Britain over the last 11 months since the Hamas attack on Israel on 7th of October last year. But I think some of the trends, some of the underlying things that we've seen have played out in similar ways in other countries. So although I'll be focusing on the UK, I think it will be interesting to get into some of the similarities and differences with other countries. And I'm going to touch on a few different areas for around 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have questions and hopefully we'll have a really good discussion. So the first thing I want to say is really to start at the beginning, but it's something that the more time that passes from as we move more distant from October 7th, we perhaps forget this point, but I think it's a really important point to always remind us of, which is that the anti-Semitic response, the abuse and harassment and attacks on Jewish communities around the world began immediately news started to spread on the 7th of October of the Hamas attack in Israel. And the reason I say this is because we're very used to this dynamic of anti-Semitism rising around the world whenever Israel is at war. We saw it during the last war in Gaza in May 21. We saw it in the kind of larger war in the summer of 2014, in December and January 2009. We saw it during Israel's second Lebanon war in 2006. If you go back, you can go back further to the Second Intifada and so on. And those waves of anti-Semitism, we assumed at the time, were fueled by anger towards what Israel was perceived to be doing in those wars. Israel is overwhelmingly the dominant military power in all of those wars. TV screens, newspapers, and more recently social media fills with images of Israeli tanks and planes and soldiers attacking and Palestinian civilians dying and being injured and so on. And we know the dynamic. It fuels anger, and some people take that anger out on Jews in the diaspora by, daubing graffiti on synagogues or on schools, shouting abuse at Jewish people in the street, through physical violence, through terrorism, and so on. And in a way, not to justify it, of course, but you can sort of understand, you can follow the twisted logic by which people do that. They're really angry about Israel, and in a misguided way, they take it out on Jews nearby. Now, that's not to excuse it, of course, and we should also note there's no other foreign conflict that really triggers that kind of reaction around the world. I mean, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 or in 2014, there was no wave of anti-Russian hate crime across Britain. It didn't happen. So you don't get the same dynamic. But still, you can sort of see how the thought process works. And this time it was completely different. It was the other way around, because on October 7th, what were our TV screens and our phones full of? It was pictures of, it was dead and injured Israelis now, not Palestinians. It was Hamas who'd invaded Israel, who were attacking and killing Israelis. And yet some people around the world reacted to that by going out and shouting abuse at Jewish people, by daubing graffiti on Jewish buildings or in Jewish areas. So it's a different dynamic. And it's a dynamic where I think it's not so much people angry about Israel and taking out on Jews, it's people who already don't like Jews. It's anti-Semites who were excited by, to put it crudely, they were excited by the sight and the idea of dead Jews. Dara Horn wrote a fantastic book, People Love Dead Jews. She didn't mean it quite like this, but this is kind of, people were excited by it. There was one incident and they wanted to join in. I think that's a really, really important, the psychology of it. And there was one incident that stuck with me in London, so much so that I used it for the title of one of the chapters in Everyday Hate. It was a couple of days after 7th of October, an ordinary Jewish man walking down the street in London, and a random stranger who's driving past shouts out of their car window, "The war is starting, free Palestine." And I think that phrase, "the war is starting," and this guy was happy. He was shouting because he wanted to join in the war. This was his way, in his own way, of joining in what Hamas had done by taking the war to Jews around the world. And of course, at the same time, we had all these protests and demonstrations started right away. On the 7th, 8th, 9th of October, all the usual groups, they organized their demonstrations, their protests, they had their banners supporting the resistance, supporting Intifada, effectively condoning, celebrating what Hamas had done. And they were happy. These protests, these demonstrations were happy. There were people out in London, hooting their car horns and waving Palestinian flags out of the windows on the night of 7th of October. And that's the hardcore of the movement that has then grown and grown and grown. And a lot of the people who get taken along with this very fashionable pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel sentiment, who turn these demonstrations from 10,000 to 100,000 people, who fill social media with memes saying all eyes on Rafah and all the rest of it. A lot of these people are not really ideological. They don't really buy into such extremist ideas. They're going along with it because it's fashionable and it's deemed to be what progressive, virtuous people do. But we shouldn't forget the hardcore of this movement is coming from a much more extreme place, and I think a much more troubling place. And this leads to my second point, which is that when we look at this movement, the real hardcore, the committed activists, they really are all in on this, right? They are all in, they are fully committed, and there's nothing that makes them pause. I've sometimes wondered in the past, how many Israelis would have to die in a terrorist attack for people in this movement, the organizers of it, the activists, to go, hang on a minute, that's not right. that's too much what Hamas have done or Hezbollah have done or Iran has done, whatever. Well, I think on October 7th, we got some kind of answer to that question, which is 1,200 dead Israelis is not enough to make them pause, to make them think, okay, that's too much. That's not right. Nor is kidnapping 250 hostages, nor is the kind of widespread reports of sexual violence and rape and torture that went on that day. And I think we see this not just with Hamas and Hezbollah, but as soon as Ansar Allah in Yemen, the Houthis got involved, this is a movement that literally condemns gay people to death by crucifixion and is, shooting rockets and drones at international shipping that have nothing to do with Israel. And yet, on all these rallies, you'll get people with placards and chants praising the Houthis, praising Yemen as they see it. I mean, it's one side in the Yemeni civil war. It doesn't, the fact that the in every other respect the clash of values is so obvious does not stop people who see themselves as progressive from aligning behind organizations like Hamas and the Houthis and Iran. They really are all in on this, and they're all in on it because this isn't just about Israel and Gaza. This is about global politics. This is about the future of the capitalist West. So much of this is a belief that this axis of resistance, as it's called, Hezbollah, Hamas, these other Islamist groups with Iran and Russia and China standing behind them, hold the promise that they will not just defeat Israel, but they will bring down the entire kind of Western-led capitalist political and economic order by which the world is structured, and another world will be born. And this has been the thinking of parts of the kind of radical left in the West since the 1960s, that the Western working class was too comfortable and bourgeois to be revolutionary anymore. And the only hope for revolution lay in what was then termed the Third World and now the Global South. And, the new left of the late 1960s imbibed all these ideas and they've spread and spread. And I think this is what's, all these chants globalize the Intifada. I think we and a lot of people in Jewish communities hear that as a direct threat to bring what we remember from the Second Intifada of the suicide bombings and shootings and so on to Jewish communities in the West. I think there's something broader and deeper in that chant. I don't think it's necessarily a chant to attack Jewish communities in the West, although we can't exclude that. I think what it represents is a desire, a belief, and a hope that Hamas resistance to Israel can be the trigger for global resistance to Western power across the board. And I think that's what's going on. But still, this sense that this kind of the hardcore of this movement are all in, it leads to some really quite bizarre and I think quite unique reactions to different aspects. There's the whole kind of systematic misinformation and denial of the atrocities on October 7th. The amount of effort that has gone into the denial of the sexual violence in particular, which kind of mirrors some of the efforts to deny Russian atrocities in Syria and and Assad's sort of chemical attacks in Syria and then Russian atrocities in Ukraine, and it's coming from similar parts of the left. But the extent of the denial of the sexual violence, in particular on October 7th, and the extent to which a lot of people in that anti-Israel movement believe that most of the Israelis who died on October 7th were killed by the IDF has kind of surprised me. I thought those details would be ignored. I thought they'd be skated over. I thought people would just move on from them or argue them away as if they're not important. But the outright denial of it, I think, is something, the extent of it is something I didn't quite expect. And I think we should acknowledge just how different that is, just how kind of new that is. It's kind of Holocaust denial in real time. And I'm not comparing what happened to the Holocaust because I hate Holocaust comparisons. but it's significant. And I thought one episode that really struck me in this respect was when Israeli forces rescued 4 hostages from Gaza in June. Noah Argamani, Almog Meherjan, Andrei Kozlov, and Shlomi Ziv were all rescued. There were some people who immediately, including very prominent journalists and commentators in Britain, but elsewhere as well, who immediately condemned this not as a incredibly ingenious and courageous rescue of 4 hostages, but as a massacre of Palestinians who turned it into not a effectively defensive operation in terms of rescuing hostages, but an offensive one. And it happened straight away. And it really struck me, actually. And I found it quite astonishing. It happened before anyone knew the true death toll in the operation. I mean, loads of numbers were flying around, as they do from Gaza immediately, and they're all obviously kind of unconfirmed and unreliable. And certainly no one knew how many of the death toll were civilians and combatants. And yet there were people whose sympathies are, and whose activism over the last year has all been, anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian, who immediately jumped to a position of this was entirely indefensible. For Israel to send special forces into Gaza to rescue its own hostages is somehow entirely indefensible and unjustified. And again, I thought that was quite an astonishing and quite a telling response, as well as being just completely detached from the reality of how things work in the real world. But I think what it said was there were some people who were actually disappointed that Israel managed to free 4 of their own hostages all on their own without needing the Qataris and the Americans and the Egyptians to do it for them. And I know that many, many more hostages have been freed through negotiations than through military operations. And a deal is still by far the most likely way to get the remaining hostages home. It's not about that, really. It's the fact that some people, when the news broke, and while Jews around the world were literally in tears of joy at this news, there were people in the kind of pro-Palestinian movement who seemed to be really unhappy about it, really irritated by it, and came up with a completely different narrative about what happened on that day to delegitimize what Israel did. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. One of them is the very simplistic kind of 2 sides sort of approach people take to this conflict, where people it's like they're picking their football team and they just support their team no matter what, in a very simplistic way, in a very unhelpful way. But I think there's a deeper thing going on, which is so much of kind of Israeli use of military force to protect Jewish life. It kind of goes against tradition a little bit. If we look at in history, the kind of Western tradition when it comes to Jews and killing, it's normally Jews getting killed, defenseless Jews getting killed, and needing to rely on the mercy and the protection of others to survive. And Israel and Zionism, the whole point of them was to overturn this tradition. And albeit Israel does not always live up to that, and its political leaders do not always live up to that, but still, that's kind of the point of Israel. And the state of Israel, I think, without that purpose is it's not really the same thing. And I think some people find that inversion of that tradition challenging. The idea that the Jewish people, that Israel now has a military force that can go and rescue Jewish life. And I think that there's a few moral inversions going on in this world that I think are very interesting. The next thing I think, and I think this is, again, normally when Israel has wars in Gaza or in Lebanon previously, they last for 2 weeks, a month maybe. You get these big flare-ups of anti-Semitism, you get the big protests, you get all the things we've seen, but they only last a few weeks and then they die down and disappear and people move on. This has been going on for nearly a year now, and I think what that means is some of the changes in the attitudes and in the discourse are going to be embedded. They're not going to just revert back to where they were prior to October 7th. And I think one thing that has really changed, and it's very noticeable, in the discourse of the pro-Palestinian movement since October 7th is that nobody talks about 1967 anymore in that movement. It's all about 1948. You know, if you are a pro-Palestinian activist and you're calling for Israel to withdraw from the West Bank and allow the Palestinians to create a state in the West Bank and Gaza, that is seen as a kind of unacceptable compromise in that movement now. You'll be called a sellout. Everything instead is about 1948. Everything we hear is 76 years of colonization, meaning that Israel shouldn't have been created, and that the whole of Israel is a settler colony. All Israelis are settlers. And the implication of that is therefore, well, if Hamas came and killed a load of them on October 7th, tough luck, what do you expect? That's what colonizers get for living on stolen land. And the idea behind it is that all of Israel is stolen land, not just the territories occupied in 1967. Now, this is a shift, I think. If you go back 10, 20 years, that was not where the balance of the discourse was in the pro-Palestinian movement. It was always there, of course. The settler colonization narrative was always there. But broadly speaking, the discourse was all about occupation, although it was ambiguous. It broadly aligned with the kind of mainstream position of the international community, which says that the West Bank and Gaza are occupied territories and should constitute a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. I think the pro-Palestine movement has moved away from that. And it's moved to a position that aligns it with Hamas and aligns it with the other kind of leading forces who are prosecuting this conflict against Israel in the region. And I think that's because that's where they have to be relevant, basically. It's really telling that it's noticeable how much President Abbas and the Palestinian Authority are just absent from all of this. They're just kind of not really relevant in where the energy and the focus of the pro-Palestinian movement is. I mean, the Palestinian ambassador in Britain, Hussam Zomlot, he's on TV, does interviews, he speaks at the rallies, but he's not the main guy, he's not the main figure. It's not his office that are organizing the rallies or setting the tone and the language. And this is partly because, you know, if you're trying to generate a social movement and a street activist movement, I mean, compromise and nuance are boring, right? If you go for two states, you're sort of accepting Zionism has a point. It has a legitimacy to it. Israelis have rights. That's not how you get tens of thousands of people out on the streets. It's the absolute binaries that are kind of fun and energizing and bring with them the dream of creating a utopia through cleansing the world of its corruption, which in this case is the existence of Israel. That's what gets people's juices flowing. But again, it's a radicalization of the discourse. And it so much of the problems that I think Jewish students face on campus, that Jewish kids are facing in school, that lots of Jewish people are facing in all sorts of sectors, is because what this does is it removes the space for a kind of compromise narrative. It removes the space for a space for Jews to argue that Israel has a right to exist, that Zionism is legitimate, that it's not just another form of Western racist colonialism and so on. Now, the reality is, I think if you ask most of the people on these, certainly the bigger protests, and a lot of the people in the student encampments, whatever, you know, would you accept a two-state solution? I think a lot of them would say yes, personally. And this brings us back to a lot of the people who attach themselves to this movement and follow it are not very deeply ideologically educated, knowledgeable, committed. A lot of it is kind of, it's fashion. But they're attaching themselves to a movement where the things they're absorbing, the common sense ideas they're absorbing is that Zionism is just racism, that there is no positive version of it. There's no positive justification for it. And that's very problematic. And I think that brings me on to my next point, which is that for the people who are ideologically very committed, people are taking the opportunity as this war is going on to press for a fundamental reassessment of Zionism, of Israel, of anti-Semitism, of the Holocaust, and of Jews, and of the place that all those things have in society and in our understanding of the world. And to illustrate what I mean, there was an article in the London Review of Books back in March by an Indian author called Pankaj Mishra. The article was called The Shoah After Gaza. And the London Review of Books is a very influential literary journal in the kind of very sort of highbrow literary sliver of British society, certainly British liberal progressive thinking. And this was a 7,500 word essay that was based on a lecture that he'd given, and he's got a book coming out in February, which I think is based on it, is a reworking of it, or maybe the same thing, I don't know. And his basic argument was that Israel is effectively has gone through some kind of process of Nazification. And he quotes various people using these words, but quotes them in a way that he clearly thinks there's something to it, and has thereby relinquished the moral legacy of the Shoah and is actually destroying the moral legacy of the Shoah. And that the entire post-war world order of international law and institutions and so on was based on a desire to construct a moral and legal framework that would prevent another Holocaust from happening. I think there is something in that. And that Israel was literally, in his words, dynamiting the entire post-war world order and creating, as he put it, a rupture in the moral history of the world. And it was very significant for him, I think, that it's Israel doing this, more significant than all the conflicts involving countries that are not Jewish and that were not, to a certain extent, born out of the Shoah and populated by Holocaust survivors and so on. He talks about Israel having turned the murder of 6 million Jews into an intense national preoccupation with a Shoah-sanctified demand for total and permanent security. I mean, as if a desire for total and permanent security is a bad thing. And I think what's significant about this is he then goes on to argue that Israel, because of all of this, because of its destruction of Gaza, or as he put it, the liquidation of Gaza, Israel is not able to carry forward the moral legacy of the Shoah. And the only people who are able to do this are supporters of the Palestinians. It's the Palestinians themselves and the people marching for Palestine in Western cities who will go some way towards redeeming the memory of the Shoah. And I think this is a really interesting article and a really dangerous article and a really dangerous set of ideas. And it was very well received by all the kind of people who read the London Review of Books. So how many of them actually read the whole article, I don't know. But anyway, it's this idea that, you know, we live in a world where kind of innocent victimhood is seen as the highest moral virtue. And this is a very kind of Christian idea that martyrdom, victimhood is virtuous. And Zionism is a rejection of that very idea. The whole point of Zionism is saying Jews don't want to be victims anymore. And we're going to do what it takes to not be victims anymore. And underpinning this article, I think, is the idea that by refusing to be victims, by using military force, sometimes in illegitimate ways, in pursuit of this avoidance of victimhood, Israel relinquishes, and therefore the Jewish people relinquish their moral standing. And this transfers onto Palestinians. And whereas Jews were the archetypal victims of the 20th century through the Holocaust, Palestinians have now become the archetypal victims of the 21st century. And I think it's on one level, it's kind of Shoah sort of inversion and so on. We're very familiar with that. But I think what's really interesting about it is that you can trace kind of the imprint of Christian theology. And Pankaj Mishra is not Christian. That's not really the point. You can trace the imprint of Christian theology in shaping Western morality that then underpins the politics and gives the politics its kind of moral drive and moral coherence. And it's almost like a modern reworking in a progressive language of the old idea that the Jews betrayed their own covenant with God and are no longer the chosen people, and the status of chosen people transfers onto a new elect. And it's just a reminder that some things don't change in a way. Some of the most powerful ideas in our world are powerful because they are a reworking of the most powerful ideas in history, sometimes in ancient history. Now, to move from ancient history to the modern day, this is kind of what's going on in the substrate of these ideas in this movement, I think. But then you can see the impact of that in a very real way in mainstream politics and media. We've just had a general election in this country. And it was very interesting to see what happened. You know, Alvin mentioned that the very first webinar I did as part of this series was talking about Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party in Britain. Well, Jeremy Corbyn's no longer in the Labour Party. He's been expelled from the party. He stood as an independent in the recent general election. The party is now run by Keir Starmer, who's from a much more mainstream Labour tradition. And Labour won the election by a landslide with a huge majority. And there were lots of reasons for that, all to do with domestic politics and the state of the Conservative Party and so on. It had nothing really to do with Israel and Jews. But there were two things went on in that general election that I think were very significant. One of them is Israel and Gaza did play a significant role in some aspects of that election. And there were 4 independent MPs who got elected on overtly sort of Gaza-centric campaigns, put it that way. There was a campaign under the name The Muslim Vote, which very openly campaigned in constituencies with large Muslim populations where there was a sitting Labour MP who they thought was vulnerable, and they hammered Labour on their position on Gaza. And this was quite striking because Labour weren't in government. They had no ability to influence what was happening in Israel and Gaza at all as the opposition, and they have not much ability to influence it as the British government, to be honest. But rather than target the Tory government, who were very supportive of Israel, this campaign went after Labour MPs, and they unseated 4 of them. They nearly unseated a couple more, some very high-profile ones. And they now have 4 members of parliament who are independents, all from this kind of Muslim vote campaign. And they've joined up with Jeremy Corbyn to form like a small, not quite an official party, but a grouping, an alliance. And in that respect, Gaza became the fuel for a kind of identity-based political campaigning of a sort that has never really had much success in Britain before. You know, people have always sort of campaigned in elections on identity issues. I mean, look, lots of Jewish people didn't want to vote Labour in the 2019 general election because of Jeremy Corbyn and because of anti-Semitism, and that's because of their identity. But their response to that was not to stand as independent Jewish candidates and set up a kind of Jewish vote campaign. It was to just vote for one of the other mainstream parties. This was something different. This is now members of parliament who are there as identity-based candidates, identity-based MPs, and it's kind of this communalist politics, which has never really worked in Britain before. And as a corollary to that, you had you had quite a significant growth in votes for fringe parties and fringe candidates of all kinds. The political system in Britain makes it very hard for small parties to do well. It biases the vote share towards or the seat share towards Labour and the Conservatives, basically. and to a certain extent protects their position and protects the system from smaller parties or extremist parties from getting seats. But still, the vote share for Conservatives and Labour dropped to one of its lowest proportions for a very long time. And loads of different small parties did well. The Greens, Reform Party, which is kind of to the right of the Conservative Party, more of a kind of hardline anti-immigrant party. The Workers' Party of Britain, which is led by George Galloway, who you might know, various independents. And what was interesting about this is that in all these small parties, you got anti-Semitism. Or certainly in Reform Party, you got Islamophobia as well. It was kind of, for the first time, or more than for any recent election, you had a lot of candidates, some of whom won their seats, some of whom had a good chance of winning, who had a track record of really quite extreme attitudes and comments expressed on social media, kind of almost like, I mean, I called it in one post I wrote, I think, I called it like the cranks election. Even though they weren't ever going to get to power, it became almost impossible to kind of keep track of the number of anti-Semitic statements and social media posts by candidates, not from Labour and the Conservatives, but from all these smaller parties, a lot of whom have been kicked out of, certainly Labour. And the fact this was happening on left and right shows us that, anti-Semitism, it's not consigned to one part of the political spectrum or the other, and it can influence mainstream politics in lots of different ways in lots of different places. And while the Labour Party went through a very painful process that meant they basically got on top of this and in terms of their internal membership and their education and candidate selection, they basically dealt with the problem. The smaller parties don't have the resources, or they're not interested, actually. The Green Party in particular, a lot of people who were expelled from Labour or left it under a cloud because of anti-Semitism went to the Greens, and the Greens weren't interested in kicking any of them out. They just gave them a home, and so on. And I think this is something we'll see more and more as elections carry on over the next few years. Now, there's a couple of other things another points I want to mention just before I finish. One of them is about university campuses. And it's a very simple question. What if education is not the answer to this problem? Right? We always say education is the answer to anti-Semitism, to racism. It's all because of ignorance and so on and so on. We need to educate about anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust, about Jewish life and all of this. And yet, universities, which are obviously the pinnacle of education, there are a lot of universities, as we know, who've got a big problem with anti-Semitism, and a problem not just amongst students, but amongst faculty. So, and there is there's been some research done suggesting that an American college education actually makes people more anti-Semitic, not less, or at least more open to certain anti-Semitic ideas. And I don't know exactly how robust that research is, and I'd like to see it repeated in different ways before sort of hanging too much on it. But what if education isn't the answer? Or rather, what if the education we've been doing it wrong? We've been educating about the wrong things, or in the wrong way, or in a way that is just not helpful for tackling this kind of anti-Semitism. And I'm going to leave that hanging as a question, because I think that is a question we all need to answer, and especially with this audience, with so many of us in this audience involved in higher education and education in different ways. I think this is a really important question for all of us to be thinking about. And then the next thing I want to mention, and this sort of is going to lead to my conclusion a little bit, is when I talk about how things have changed since 7th of October and how the changes have become really entrenched and really shifted things. Earlier this summer, there were a whole series of riots in Britain by kind of far-right, racist kind of elements in society that began as a reaction to the most awful crime in Southport, which is a fairly small town in the northwest of England, where someone went into a this is I apologize for this because it's quite an upsetting incident. someone went into a children's dance class, a primary school age dance class, and stabbed 10 or 11 children and a couple of adults, and 3 of the children died. It was completely random and appalling crime. And the rumor immediately spread online that the person who'd done this was a Muslim and a recent illegal immigrant or asylum seeker, none of which was true. None of which was true. But people believed it enough that the very next day there was a far-right protest outside the local mosque in Southport, which turned violent, and then there were violent protests in about 30 or 40 different places around Britain. In a couple of places, people tried to burn down hotels that were used as asylum seeker kind of hostels. It was a terrible situation. And really, this should have been the reason I raise it in this context is this should have been an opportunity for everyone to come together. You know, interfaith networks have sort of really fallen apart since October 7th. It's been very difficult to bring them back together. And this should have been an opportunity for everyone, Jewish community, Muslim community, the left, mainstream society, everyone, to come together and condemn this violence, condemn the racism that lay behind it and the misinformation and so on, and find some common ground. And instead, what happened was, while that did happen and there were big anti-racist and anti-fascist protests and mobilizations and lots of mainstream political condemnation and mainstream media kind of condemnation for the far-right riots and support for the anti-racist protests, and so, within that, a very quite widespread and powerful narrative very quickly developed that Zionists were to blame for these riots, right? That it was all Zionists who'd done the racist riots. And this took 2 forms. One of them, a slightly kind of amorphous, vague idea that some of the kind of far-right figures in the kind of sort of anti-Muslim street movement led by a guy called Tommy Robinson or Stephen Yaxley Lennon, who you might know of, sort of claimed to be pro-Israel. And Tommy Robinson himself has in the past visited Israel and had some funding from certainly one kind of pro-Israel think tank in America, which I think was an extremely misguided and foolish thing for them to have done. But anyway, so part of the theory was, well, Tommy Robinson's a Zionist, so therefore they're all Zionists. There was also a much more concrete conspiracy theory that Israel had literally orchestrated these riots to punish the new Labour government because they had taken a more critical stance against Israel's operations in Gaza. You know, that they were not objecting anymore. They'd withdrawn Britain's objection to the request for arrest warrants at the International Criminal Court, and that they were going to impose a limited arms embargo, which has since happened, or they've cancelled some arms export licenses. And this conspiracy theory was that Israel had literally made these, you know, pushed the button on these riots and got their puppets all over the British far right to do it. And so, I mean, it's obviously nonsense, obviously complete nonsense. But what was really striking is it was pretty widespread in that movement, in the kind of anti-racist, anti-fascist left that organized the response to the racist riots. You saw this in a lot of places online. You heard it in some of the speeches. You know, supposedly respectable media outlets like Middle East Eye lent some credence to it. And I think this tells us how much things have changed, actually, in this respect, since October 7th. That in that world, that kind of anti-racist, activist, progressive world, Zionism and fascism are just all over one. And the idea that even liberal Zionists would be part of an anti-fascist or anti-racist mobilization is like anathema. It can't happen. And I think this was very telling. And I think to a certain extent, it's a convenient safety valve. This conspiracy theory that the riots were not really carried out by ordinary British people, it was the Zionists controlling them, it enables people both on both sides of it, actually, on the far right and on the kind of Muslim community side and on the left, to sort of coalesce around a common enemy and a common hate figure and a common conspiracy theory, rather than doing the hard work of dealing with the real community tensions that exist in this country. And that's how conspiracy theories always operate, as a convenient safety valve. But it's a sign of how much the whole idea of Zionism and Zionists has been denigrated over the last 11 months on the anti-racist left. And I fear that it may not be salvageable in that world. And a consequence of that and a corollary of that, and this is my last point, is everyone is entrenching within their identities over this war, over this conflict. Everyone. And to a certain extent, lots of people have been radicalized in their attitudes to it. And I don't mean radicalized in the way we normally understand it, of towards violent extremism and all of that. I just mean losing the mental and emotional space and energy for nuance, for seeing the other side, for considering the different angles, for empathizing with the humanity of the other, and so on. It's really struck me the number of British workplaces, companies, employees, where the Jewish employees now have a Jewish WhatsApp group that never did before 7th of October. There are ones for whole sectors. There's ones for, whether it's medicine, law, the media, whatever. But within companies, within organizations, the number of people who come to CST and tell us about anti-Semitism in their workplace, and they'll say, yeah, we discussed it on our Jewish employees WhatsApp group. And I'll ask them, did that exist before October 7th? No, it was a reaction to it. Same with social networks as well. People are entrenching or retrenching, closing down their worlds within their identity spaces. And it's a fracturing of society that is happening in a very silent way, and it's beneath the surface. And I don't think there's any official understanding of it. And I certainly don't know exactly how. There's certainly no policies to reverse it. But this is where we are. This is where we are nearly a year on. There will be all sorts of things going on in the UK on the anniversary of October 7th of that weekend. There'll be big community vigils, memorials, there'll be synagogue services, there'll be loads of stuff going on in the Jewish community. In a way that I think is a sign that the community is still traumatized by it and by the ongoing situation, and still feels very deeply affected by it. At the same time, Jewish life goes on in a really open and positive way, and there's this kind of weird contradictory dynamic of kind of open and closed and fearful and proud and so on that are all happening at the same time. But within that, I think there is in a way quite a sad sort of closing down a little bit internally within identities. And I think when we look at what are the solutions to this, how do we deal with this, as well as looking at how do we deal with the anti-Semitism, how do we deal with the extremism that's going on out there, I think within our Jewish communities, we also need to look at what are the programs and we need to think of to give our own communities the resilience and the self-confidence to sort of open up again. So that's my final thought. I'll finish on that point. And I'm very happy to hear anyone's thoughts and questions.